Hello, friends, and welcome to Sleepy Stories. I'm truly glad you're here tonight. Wherever you're listening from, I'd love to know, where in the world are you and what time is it there right now? There's something quietly remarkable about how a story travels, slipping through walls and across rooftops, crossing cities, seas, and continents, until it arrives almost invisibly in so many different nights at once. Now, when we hear about the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the story is often reduced to a single year, 476 CE, and a single young emperor, Romulus Augustulus. It can sound sudden, final, as if an empire that had shaped the world simply stopped. But history rarely ends in a single breath. What happened in that year makes sense only when we see it as the final visible movement in a much longer transformation. Decades of financial strain, shifting loyalties, military restructuring, and quiet negotiations over who truly held power. Armies still marched, cities still stood, laws were still written and enforced. Life did not simply dissolve. Instead, something subtler occurred. The deposition of Romulus was not the disappearance of Rome, nor the collapse of its civilization. It was the moment when an imperial title in the western half of the empire ceased to be filled, not because authority vanished, but because those who commanded soldiers and resources no longer needed that particular office to govern, and those who might have restored it lacked the means to do so. Tonight, we'll gently trace how that shift unfolded, how an empire can fade not with a single crash but with a gradual rearranging of power, until one day a throne simply remains empty. So settle in, and let's begin. In the early 5th century, the Western Empire still had many of the things that once made Roman power durable. A tax system, great landowners producing agricultural surpluses, provincial administrations that could issue orders and collect dues, and a legal framework that still mattered in courts and contracts. It had armies too, but increasingly those armies were assembled and maintained in ways that differed from the older imperial model. The West also had a geographic disadvantage that became harder to manage over time. The eastern half of the empire, governed from Constantinople, held the richest and most reliably taxable provinces. Much of the eastern Mediterranean's cities and countryside, the major grain and tax base of Egypt, and the densely administered territories of the Near East. The West depended heavily on revenues from Italy, southern Gaul, parts of the Danubian regions when they were stable, and above all North Africa after the loss of much of the Western Balkans, when those revenue sources were disrupted by civil war, by the creation of semi-autonomous regional powers, and by the loss of key provinces. The Western state could still issue laws and appoint officials, but it struggled to do the thing an empire most needs to do in a crisis: pay and supply armies consistently. The central mechanism of Roman survival had long been a cycle that linked taxation to military capacity and military capacity to taxation. Taxes and requisitions supported soldiers. Soldiers defended frontiers and internal order. Defense and order protected the agricultural base and trade routes that made taxes collectible. Once that cycle began to fail in parts of the West, it failed in ways that fed back into the system. If a frontier region suffered repeated incursions, land could be abandoned and communities impoverished. If communities impoverished, taxes fell short. If taxes fell short, the state's ability to keep troops in the field declined. And if troops declined, the frontier suffered more incursions. This is not a claim that the West ran out of money in a simple sense. It is that the empire's financial and administrative instruments were designed for a world in which the state could reliably enforce its claims. When enforcement became intermittent, the instruments still existed, but their output, revenue in grain, gold, and labor, became less dependable. A second long-term change was the growing importance of military strongmen who controlled access to the emperor and controlled the field armies near Italy. In the late Roman system, emperors were expected to secure legitimacy through recognition by the army, the court, and important urban constituencies, and they were expected to govern through an administrative elite that issued laws and managed taxation. But by the 5th century in the West, the men who were most decisive in politics were often not emperors but commanders, magistri militum and other senior officers who could mobilize troops, negotiate with external groups, and decide who sat on the throne. This pattern did not appear overnight. It built on earlier centuries in which emperors were frequently made and unmade by armies. What became distinctive in the 5th century West was that the emperors increasingly looked like figureheads used to cloak the authority of generals, while the generals increasingly had to bargain with troops whose composition and expectations were changing. The third long-term development was the changing relationship between the Roman state and various barbarian groups on or beyond its frontiers. The late empire had long recruited soldiers from outside Roman territory and settled some groups within imperial borders under negotiated conditions. In the 5th century, under pressure from war and political fragmentation, the West increasingly relied on arrangements in which large armed groups were settled within the empire as federates, often under their own leaders, in exchange for military service. These arrangements could take many forms and were not always identical from region to region. But in practice, many of them meant that the Western government ceded a degree of local control over land, taxation, and armed force in exchange for immediate military support. That exchange could stabilize a region in the short term, but it could also harden into a de facto transfer of sovereignty if the central government could not later reassert direct administrative and fiscal control. If the fall of the Western Empire is approached as a question of trigger and catalyst, it helps to be precise about what exactly fell. In 476, what ended was not Roman culture in the West, not even Roman administration in many places, but the practice of maintaining a separate Western imperial throne occupied by a recognized Augustus in Italy or nearby, issuing laws and appointing officials as the apex of a Western state that could still claim to govern provinces. The catalyst for that end was a revolt in Italy by the very troops whose existence was supposed to secure the emperor. The trigger was not a single barbarian invasion from outside, but a conflict inside Italy about land, payment, and who had the authority to distribute resources to soldiers. The immediate actors were a child or teenager emperor, Romulus, his father, Orestes, who had put him on the throne, a rival commander, Odoacer, who mobilized discontented troops, and the Eastern emperor and court, which remained a crucial source of legitimacy even when it could not enforce its will in Italy. To understand why a revolt over land and military rewards could end the Western imperial office, it is necessary to look closely at how the Western court in the mid-5th century tried to keep an army without the tax base that earlier emperors had enjoyed. The loss of North Africa to the Vandals in the 430s was a central blow. North Africa was not merely another province. It was a dense agricultural and urban region whose tax revenues and grain shipments had long been crucial to the Western state, especially to Italy and Rome. When the Vandal kingdom established itself there, the Western court lost a large part of its dependable revenue stream and a strategic base that also affected naval power in the Western Mediterranean. Without Africa, the Western government faced a harsher arithmetic: fewer resources to pay troops, fewer resources to buy loyalty, fewer resources to fund operations aimed at restoring lost provinces, and fewer resources to stabilize regions like Gaul that were increasingly dominated by local power brokers and federate kings. At the same time, the West's political center of gravity had already shifted away from the old senatorial capital at Rome. The imperial court spent long periods in places like Ravenna, which was defensible, and had good access to the Adriatic and northern Italy's logistical networks. The emperors and their administrations continued to issue laws. The Senate continued to exist. Aristocratic families continued to hold offices. But the ability of the court to project power into the provinces was increasingly dependent on negotiation. Negotiation with local Roman elites, negotiation with federate leaders, negotiation with the Eastern Empire for support, and negotiation with the army for continued service. Within this environment, the empire's Western throne became a prize and a tool. Whoever could place a compliant emperor on it could use the aura of imperial legitimacy to issue commands, to claim taxes, to appoint officials, and to negotiate with other powers. Yet because the Western court's resources were dwindling, placing an emperor on the throne did not automatically provide the ability to control the whole West. It provided legal and symbolic authority, which might or might not be matched by the ability to pay troops and to win battles. Over the 5th century, the Western throne was occupied by a succession of emperors who depended heavily on the support of particular generals or coalitions of interest, and who often reigned briefly amid civil conflict. This constant turnover was not merely a political drama. It was an administrative problem. Frequent usurpations and rapid regime changes disrupted tax collection, redirected resources to immediate military needs, and made provincial elites more cautious about committing to a central authority whose survival was uncertain. By the 450s and 460s, the Western state had survived repeated crises, but at a price. In Gaul, parts of the territory had passed under Visigothic control. In Spain, Visigothic and other powers competed. In Britain, Roman administration had already ceased earlier in the century. In Africa, the Vandals controlled the provinces that had once funded Western recovery. Italy remained the heartland. But even there, the court's ability to command depended on the loyalty of armies that were increasingly composed of men whose ethnic and regional origins varied, and whose expectations about rewards and settlement were shaped by the very federate arrangements the empire had used for decades. One can see the background to 476 in the attempt of the Western Emperor Majorian in the late 450 and early 460 to rebuild imperial power. Majorian is significant not because he nearly saved Rome in a romantic sense, but because his reign shows the structural difficulties of restoration. He tried to reassert imperial authority in Gaul and to mount an expedition against the Vandals in Africa. Such an expedition required ships, supplies, trained troops, and above all funding. The failure of that effort, whether through defeat, logistical problems, or betrayal, illustrates a wider reality. Major reconquests required a level of coordinated resource extraction and military capacity that the Western government no longer reliably possessed. Majorian's overthrow by the general Ricimer underscores another reality. Even a competent emperor needed the support of a power broker in Italy who commanded troops, and those power brokers could remove emperors who threatened their position or failed to deliver results. Ricimer's career also illustrates how the Western imperial office could become subordinate to the politics of the Italian military elite. Ricimer, of non-Roman origin by ancestry, but operating within the Roman military and political system, acted as kingmaker. He could not easily become emperor himself in the eyes of Roman tradition and certain constituencies. so he elevated and deposed emperors who suited his coalition. Under such conditions, the emperor's role as supreme commander and administrator was often hollowed out. Yet this hollowing out was not merely symbolic. It affected policy. If a general could replace emperors, then long-term planning, especially expensive campaigns, became hostage to short-term political survival. It also affected fiscal policy. If an emperor needed to appease commanders and troops immediately, resources would be spent on donatives and emergency provisioning rather than on rebuilding stable revenue systems. By the early 470s, the Western imperial throne was entangled with the Eastern court's interests. The Eastern emperor and his administration had their own priorities, defending the eastern frontiers, managing their own internal politics, and maintaining influence in the West without assuming the full cost of restoring it. The East could recognize Western emperors, send support, or withhold it. Recognition mattered because legitimacy in the Roman world was not simply a local affair. An emperor ideally was recognized across the empire. Coins, laws, and official correspondence reflected these relationships. A Western emperor not recognized by the East was more clearly a usurper, and recognition affected how provincial elites and commanders calculated their interests. In 474 and 475, this interplay becomes more acute. Julius Nepos, a Western emperor recognized by the East, held power, but his position in Italy was insecure. A commander named Orestes, who had a career that included service under Attila's Huns and then within Roman structures, rose to prominence. Orestes was appointed to a high military position and then turned against Nepos. Nepos fled Italy, commonly associated with flight to Dalmatia, while Orestes installed his own son as emperor. That son was Romulus, later nicknamed Augustulus, Little Augustus, a diminutive that reflects both his youth and the perception of his weakness. The nickname itself is a clue to how contemporaries and later writers interpreted the moment. An empire that once elevated powerful emperors now elevated a boy whose reign depended on his father's command. This usurpation is one of the most direct political preconditions for 476. The Western throne in Italy had been seized by a military commander who did not take the title himself, but ruled through a puppet. That arrangement might have continued if Orestes could satisfy the army and defend Italy. But Orestes faced the same basic problem that had haunted Western rulers for decades. Soldiers required reliable rewards. The army in Italy, like many late Roman armies, included large numbers of men who identified as belonging to groups the Romans called barbarians, including Heruli, Sciuri, and Tersalingi in later accounts, among others. Many of these men were not simply hired mercenaries in a modern sense. They were part of the evolving military fabric of the late empire, warriors and retainers who served under leaders, expected land or pay, and whose loyalty was mediated by patronage and the distribution of resources. The immediate catalyst for the revolt that toppled Orestes and ended Romulus's reign was a demand by these troops for land in Italy. The demand is often represented as a request for a third of the land, an allotment that echoes other settlement arrangements in the late empire, where land or its revenues were assigned to soldiers or federate groups. Whether the exact fraction was applied uniformly, or how it was envisioned in administrative terms, is a matter where the surviving sources do not provide the kind of detailed fiscal documentation modern historians would like. But the essential point is clear. The troops wanted a settlement that would make their service sustainable and would anchor their position within Italy. Orestes refused. His refusal was not merely personal stubbornness. Granting land on that scale would have meant imposing a heavy burden on Italian landowners and would have threatened the support of key elites whose cooperation the regime needed. It would also have been a public admission that the state could no longer pay its soldiers by traditional means and thus had to pay them by transferring control of productive resources. Into this conflict stepped Odoacer. Odoacer's origins are described differently in different sources, but he emerges as a commander capable of uniting the discontented troops. He promised them what Orestes would not: settlement and reward. The revolt that followed was swift and decisive. Orestes was defeated and killed. His brother Paul was also killed in the fighting. The key point for understanding 476 is that this was not primarily an invasion from outside Italy. It was an internal military coup, conducted by troops already within the imperial system, against an Italian regime that had itself come to power by overthrowing a recognized emperor. When Odoacer marched on Ravenna and took control, Romulus Augustulus was deposed. The sources suggest Romulus was not executed. He was spared and granted some form of pension and residence, often associated in later tradition with Campania. The sparing of Romulus is itself revealing. Odoacer did not need to eliminate the boy as a threat if the institution that made him emperor could be rendered irrelevant. Killing Romulus might have produced backlash or martyrdom narratives. Deposing him and neutralizing him quietly reduced the risk of a rallying point for opposition. It also suggests that the imperial office in the West had become less the center of real power than a ceremonial capstone that could be removed without collapsing daily governance in Italy. The most famous gesture associated with 476 is the handling of the imperial regalia. According to later narratives, the imperial insignia were sent to the Eastern emperor, and the Western court indicated that a separate Western emperor was no longer necessary, implying that one emperor could suffice for the whole Roman world. The symbolism here is powerful, but its practical meaning is even more important. By sending regalia and making such a statement, the Italian regime under Odoacer sought legitimacy from Constantinople. It was an attempt to convert raw military victory in Italy into recognized authority within the Roman legal order. Odoacer did not initially claim to be Emperor of the West. Instead, he positioned himself as a ruler in Italy under the nominal authority of the Eastern Emperor, seeking titles and recognition that would stabilize his rule. This was the decisive institutional shift. Italy would be ruled by a king-like figure with an army and a court, while the language of Roman legitimacy would be preserved through formal subordination, at least on paper, to the Eastern Emperor. Here the fall of the Western Empire becomes a matter of constitutional practice, not of sudden civilizational collapse. The end of the Western imperial line in Italy did not mean the end of Roman offices. Many Roman administrative structures persisted: tax assessment mechanisms, legal courts, senatorial status, and the use of Roman law in documents and disputes. What changed was the apex. There was no longer a Western Augustus issuing laws as an independent imperial colleague of the Eastern Augustus. Instead, a king in Italy ruled with military backing and sought legitimacy through recognition by Constantinople. In other words, the fall was a transformation in the highest level of political organization in the West, catalyzed by the inability of the Italian regime to meet the army's demands without alienating the landowning base, and triggered by a coup that replaced one military strongman's household with another. Yet even that is not the whole causation, because it risks making 476 appear inevitable once Orestes refused land. The deeper causation lies in why the regime in Italy had become so dependent on bargaining with troops in the first place. That dependency reflects the long erosion of the Western tax base and the long fragmentation of authority. If the Western government had retained Africa, if it had maintained stable control over Gaul and Spain, if it had avoided repeated civil wars, it might have paid troops in money and supplies rather than through land settlements. It might have kept a more thoroughly Romanized command structure in which emperors could act as effective supreme commanders rather than as figureheads. But those conditions no longer held. The refusal of Orestes to grant land was a spark thrown onto a landscape already dry from decades of fiscal and military stress. The role of Julius Nepos illustrates this point. Nepos, the emperor who had been driven from Italy by Orestes, did not simply vanish from political reality in 475. He remained alive and continued to claim the Western imperial title from Dalmatia for some years. This means that the end of the Western Empire in 476 was not even a clean end in terms of claimants. There was still a recognized Western emperor in exile, at least in some perspectives, and the Eastern court's recognition of Nepos mattered. The persistence of Nepos's claim underscores that the decisive issue was not whether there existed a man with the title, Augustus, but whether there existed a workable Western imperial government in Italy capable of commanding troops and extracting resources. In 476, that government ceased to function as an independent imperial court. That is what fell. In practical terms, the deposition of Romulus was a reallocation of the remaining Western imperial apparatus in Italy. The Senate and aristocracy still mattered, not as rulers in their own right, but as intermediaries who could manage local order and who represented continuity. Odoacer's regime could not govern Italy without cooperation from Roman elites who understood taxation, law, land tenure, and the social networks that made administration possible. At the same time, those elites could not protect their interests without a ruler who could control the army. This mutual dependence helps explain why the transition did not necessarily produce immediate administrative chaos in Italy. The new king needed the old administrative skeleton. The old elite needed the new king's coercive power. So when a viewer asks for the trigger, the catalyst, and the reason, the most accurate answer is layered. The immediate trigger was the refusal of Orestes to meet the army's land demands and the consequent revolt led by Odoacer. The catalyst that made that trigger decisive was the fact that the Western imperial office had already become subordinate to military power brokers and no longer carried the resources necessary to restore the older imperial model. The deeper reason was the long contraction of the Western states' fiscal and military capacity, driven by loss of key provinces, repeated internal conflicts, and the rise of territorial powers within the West that no longer depended on the Western emperor for legitimacy or resources. To see how these layers interact, it helps to trace the decades leading up to 476 in a way that emphasizes mechanisms rather than just events. Consider the Western court's repeated need to solve military threats through settlement and negotiation. When groups crossed the Rhine in the early 5th century, when Goths moved through the Balkans and into Italy earlier, and when various federate arrangements were made in Gaul and elsewhere, each solution often traded immediate stability for long-term fragmentation. A federate king who received land and recognition might defend a frontier, but he might also become the de facto ruler of a province. When central authority later demanded taxes or obedience, the federate regime might resist, especially if the central authority could not field an army to compel compliance. Over time, The map of the West changed from provinces ruled directly by imperial governors to regions where Roman and post-Roman rulers competed, negotiated, and sometimes merged their administrative practices. At the same time, the empire's internal politics repeatedly consumed resources. Civil wars are expensive. They disrupt tax collection and trade. They require armies to be concentrated against rivals rather than against external threats, and they create incentives for commanders to seize resources quickly. In the West, the repeated elevation and overthrow of emperors by generals did not simply reflect a weak state. It was part of how the late Roman state functioned under stress. But it also meant that no regime had the time and stability to rebuild the fiscal base and to restore direct control over provinces once lost. Even when competent rulers arose, they faced opponents within the imperial system itself. This is why the deposition of Romulus can be seen as a final rational choice by Italy's new ruler rather than as a purely destructive act. Once Odoacer had military control, he could have tried to appoint another Western emperor, perhaps someone acceptable to Constantinople, and rule behind him. But doing so would have revived an institution that might constrain him, and it would have required maintaining the appearance and expense of an imperial court. Alternatively, he could rule as king, keep Roman administration working, and seek recognition from the Eastern emperor that would make his position legal enough for Roman elites to accept. The second course offered more autonomy with fewer costs. It was also consistent with how power had been operating. The general or king held real authority. The emperor had become, in Italy's circumstances, optional. The Eastern court's response mattered. The Eastern emperor had to weigh whether to accept Odoacer's rule in Italy as a subordinate arrangement or to reject it and attempt to restore Nepos or another Western emperor by force. But mounting such an intervention would have required money, troops, ships, and political will, and it would have risked destabilizing the East's own security. The East had its own wars and internal issues. Even when the East did intervene in the West at times during the 5th century, success was not guaranteed, and the costs were substantial. Recognition of Odoacer, even if reluctant or conditional, could be the least costly path while preserving the ideological claim that the Roman Empire remained one entity under one emperor. From the perspective of people living in Italy in the late 5th century, the change may have looked less like an ending and more like another regime change at the top, with familiar continuities below. Tax demands still existed. Courts still heard cases. Landowners still managed estates. Cities still negotiated with rulers. The army still needed feeding and paying. What had changed was the legal fiction and political practice that Italy was the seat of a Western emperor who could claim, even theoretically, to command provinces beyond Italy. The West, as an imperial jurisdiction, had already been shrinking. 476 formalized a reality in which Italy's ruler no longer pretended to be an emperor's subordinate officer within a Western imperial hierarchy. Instead, he positioned himself as a king ruling Italy under the overarching legitimacy of Constantinople. If one insists on naming the Western empire's cause of death in institutional terms, it was the failure to maintain a fiscal military state capable of reproducing itself. A state reproduces itself when it can collect enough resources to maintain forces that keep resource collection possible. In the 5th century West, that loop broke in too many regions, and it broke irreversibly once Africa was lost, and once large territorial military regimes emerged within the empire. After that, emperors in Italy were increasingly creatures of the Italian army and its commanders. That made the imperial office vulnerable to the very group it was supposed to command. When the Italian army decided it would follow Odoacer rather than Orestes, the emperor installed by Orestes had no independent base to resist. The deposition was therefore not only a political event, it was the manifestation of a structural shift. Sovereignty in Italy flowed from control of armed force and the distribution of land and revenue, not from the hereditary or constitutional legitimacy of an emperor. The idea of a single catalyst can also be sharpened by identifying the moment when the Western throne became unnecessary rather than merely weak. That moment comes when a ruler in Italy can achieve three things without an emperor: keep the army loyal through land or payments, keep Roman elites cooperative through continuity of law and status, and secure enough legitimacy, or at least non-intervention, from Constantinople to prevent an Eastern-backed restoration. Odoacer's victory over Orestes gave him the first. His decision to spare Romulus and to work with Roman institutions helped achieve the second. The gesture of sending regalia and framing the situation in terms of one emperor helped with the third. Once those were in place, the Western imperial throne was not merely vacant, it was redundant. None of this means that 476 should be treated as the end of everything Roman in the West. It should be treated as the end of a particular constitutional arrangement, a Western imperial court in Italy. After 476, many Roman practices continued under new rulers. The language of Roman law and administration remained influential. The status of senatorial aristocrats did not vanish overnight, and the Eastern Empire continued to think of itself as the Roman Empire. Yet 476 remains meaningful, because it marks the point at which the Western imperial title stopped being the instrument through which power in Italy was organized. It also became a convenient marker for later writers because it fits a narrative of finality. A last emperor deposed, regalia sent away, a king ruling in Italy. To explain how exactly it happened in operational terms, the chain is straightforward. A recognized Western emperor, Nepos, was removed from Italy by a military commander, Orestes. Orestes elevated his son Romulus as emperor, ruling in practice through his own authority. The Italian army, or a substantial portion of it, demanded land allocations as compensation and security. Orestes refused. Odoacer, a commander among those troops, took leadership of the discontented forces, defeated and killed Orestes, seized Ravenna, and deposed Romulus. Rather than elevating a new Western emperor, Odoacer ruled as king in Italy and sought legitimacy by communicating with the Eastern emperor and sending the Western imperial regalia. In the background, Nepos remained a claimant in exile for a time, but Italy's political center no longer operated through a Western Augustus. That is the mechanics of 476. To explain why exactly it happened, the chain is longer and involves the prior weakening of the Western fiscal and military system, the rise of generals as kingmakers, the increasing reliance on federate arrangements and land-based rewards, the loss of key tax provinces, especially Africa, and the inability of the Western court to sustain long-term reconquest and stabilization efforts. In that longer chain, Orestes' refusal is a proximate trigger, and Odoacer's coup is the decisive act. But both depend on the conditions that made the army's land demand both urgent and politically explosive. From here, the story continues into what followed. How Odoacer ruled, how Roman administration adapted under his regime, how the Eastern Empire responded over time, and how Italy later became the target of reconquest under the Eastern Emperor Justinian in the 6th century. But the fall itself, in the strict sense of the Western imperial office's end in Italy, is best understood as a military fiscal crisis resolved through a coup, then stabilized through a constitutional rebranding. From emperor to king, from independent Western court to nominal subordination to Constantinople, and from an empire that claimed the West to an Italy that functioned as a post-imperial kingdom operating with Roman tools. Odoacer's first problem after Ravenna was not how to replace an emperor, but how to make Italy governable with the resources and institutions still available. A coup that succeeded at the top could still fail if it broke the habits that kept taxation, land tenure, and courts functioning. Italy in the late 5th century still contained a large landowning class, municipal elites in many towns, and a senatorial aristocracy whose cooperation mattered for extracting revenue and maintaining order. Odoacer's victory was therefore only the opening move. The consolidation that followed depended on how he handled 3 constituencies at once: the troops who had elevated him, the Roman elites who administered and owned much of the productive land, and the Eastern imperial court whose recognition could stabilize or destabilize his position. The troops' demand for land was the immediate origin of Odoacer's regime, and it continued to shape its internal settlement. Late Roman governments had long used a range of devices to support armies: direct pay in coin, rations in kind, requisitions, and various forms of assignment of revenues from land. By the 5th century, especially in regions where cash flow was unreliable, settlement on land or the assignment of a share of land revenues was a recurring solution. The precise legal form such settlements took in Italy under Odoacer is not always visible in surviving documentation, and scholars continue to debate exactly how uniformly it was implemented and how it interacted with earlier patterns of landholding. But the governing logic is clear and consistent with other late Roman precedents. The army needed a stable source of support that did not depend entirely on a fragile central payroll. If Odoacer could satisfy that need, he could reduce the risk that the same kind of mutiny that toppled Orestes would topple him. At the same time, if land allocations were too disruptive, they could alienate the landowners whose estates and tenants produced the surplus that fed towns, supplied troops, and generated tax revenue. This was the balance late Roman rulers increasingly had to strike. In earlier periods, large donatives and regular pay could sometimes substitute for land settlement. In Odoacer's Italy, the fiscal room for such solutions was limited. The loss of Africa had not been reversed. The Western Mediterranean sea lanes were not reliably in Italian hands. Revenues were narrowed. The state could still levy and administer, but with less margin for error. That is why Odoacer's approach to Roman elites and institutions is not a minor detail, but part of the core mechanism that allowed post-imperial rule in Italy to work. The Senate in Rome still existed as a corporate body of high-status men, and senatorial families still held great estates and still mattered in the politics of honor and office. Odoacer's government did not need to abolish that class. It needed it to continue performing functions that the imperial state had long outsourced to cooperation with local elites, maintaining civic order, managing patronage networks, and helping keep the fiscal system operating. The administrative vocabulary and much of the office structure remained Roman. Offices concerned with finance, legal adjudication, urban management, and provincial administration persisted to varying degrees, and Roman law continued to be applied in many contexts. The point was not that nothing changed, but that the most useful parts of the Roman governing toolkit were retained, because they were still the most efficient way to rule a complex, densely settled, and legally sophisticated region like Italy. Legitimacy mattered as much as continuity. Odoacer's title is often rendered in later narratives as king of Italy. But the practical status he sought was closer to a recognized ruler within the Roman political order, even if that order no longer included a Western emperor. The Eastern emperor at the time, Zeno, was the central figure whose formal recognition could turn Odoacer from a successful usurper into a lawful authority in Roman terms. The Eastern court's choices were constrained. It had its own military and political challenges, and it could not treat Italy as a simple province to be reclaimed at will. It also faced a delicate question of principle. If the East accepted the end of the Western imperial office too easily, it might encourage other regional military regimes to detach while still claiming to act for Rome. Julius Nepos, the deposed Western emperor, was a complicating factor in this legitimacy puzzle. Nepos had been recognized by the East as Western emperor and continued to claim the title from Dalmatia after his expulsion from Italy. That meant that, strictly speaking, Odoacer's act in 476 did not end the existence of a claimant to the Western imperial title. It ended the existence of an emperor in Italy. For several years after 476, there was an emperor in exile with Eastern recognition, and that mattered because it gave Constantinople a legal and ideological alternative to Odoacer. As long as Nepos lived, the East could, in principle, claim that the West still had an emperor, and that Italy was merely under the control of a rebel. This tension came to a head in the years immediately after 476. Odoacer needed a settlement with the East that would protect him from an Eastern-backed campaign, or from internal conspiracies, supported by the idea of restoring the rightful emperor. The East, for its part, had reasons to avoid an expensive and uncertain intervention in Italy, but it also had reasons to avoid endorsing a complete break. The solution that emerged was, at least initially, a kind of formal ambiguity. Odoacer could present himself as ruling Italy with Eastern approval, while the East could maintain the notion of imperial unity without immediately rebuilding the Western court. This was not unusual in late Roman politics. There were many moments in which practical power and constitutional language diverged, and both sides used the divergence to keep options open. A decisive change occurred in 480, when Julius Nepos was killed in Dalmatia. The sources do not allow a fully detailed reconstruction of the intrigue behind his death, but its consequence is clearer than its precise internal mechanics. With Nepos gone, the East lost the most straightforward living alternative Western emperor who could be restored to Italy. That did not force immediate recognition of Odoacer as an independent sovereign, but it narrowed the field of legitimate claimants and made Odoacer's position more stable. Odoacer then moved to bring Dalmatia under his control, removing a nearby base from which a rival could claim imperial authority. In Roman strategic terms, Dalmatia mattered because it sat across the Adriatic and could serve as a bridge between Eastern influence and Italian politics. Securing it reduced vulnerability. Odoacer's external politics in the Mediterranean were shaped by another persistent power, the Vandal kingdom in North Africa. Africa was not only a fiscal prize, it was a naval and strategic one. Control of African ports and fleets allowed the Vandals to project power into the central Mediterranean, including Sicily and the Italian coasts, and to influence politics through raids, seizures, and negotiation. A ruler in Italy who wanted to stabilize revenue and trade had to deal with that reality. The surviving sources indicate periods of conflict and periods of negotiation between Italy and the Vandals, including arrangements that could reduce raids or stabilize control over islands. The specifics are often fragmentary, but the structural fact is not. As long as Africa remained outside Italian control, Italy's rulers had to treat the Vandals as a major constraint on economic recovery and maritime security. Within Italy, Odoacer's authority relied on the same basic late Roman triangle of power: army, land, and administration. The army needed to be fed and rewarded. Feeding required collection in kind or purchase, which depended on the agricultural base. Reward increasingly depended on land or land revenues. Administration required men trained in law and record keeping, which meant continued reliance on Roman elites. Each of these pillars limited the others. If the army demanded too much land, elites would resist. If elites resisted too strongly, the army might revolt or plunder. If the administration broke down, the revenues feeding both army and elite lifestyles would shrink. In such a system, rulers were often conservative not because they lacked imagination, but because the costs of breaking established patterns could be catastrophic. This is where the meaning of the fall becomes clearer in institutional terms. Under the Western emperors, the apex of the system was an Augustus whose legitimacy was expressed through laws, coins, and the language of imperial command. Under Odoacer, the apex became a military king who used Roman law and offices, but did not embody the imperial office himself. The machinery below could continue, but the ideological center shifted. That shift had implications for how people framed authority. Roman aristocrats could continue to think in Roman legal categories while adapting to a political fact. Sovereignty in Italy now rested with a king who held power through the army and who negotiated legitimacy with Constantinople. The Eastern Empire's longer-term response to this new situation was not immediate reconquest but strategic management. Constantinople had to decide whether to tolerate a king in Italy as a quasi-imperial officer, or whether to replace him with someone more controllable. That question intersected with one of the Eastern court's own problems: the presence of the Ostrogoths in the Balkans and their leader Theoderic. Theoderic and his followers were a powerful military force that the East alternately fought, paid, and attempted to integrate. For the Eastern Emperor, moving Theoderic's forces out of the Balkans could relieve pressure close to Constantinople. If those forces could be directed toward Italy, they might also remove Odoacer, whose autonomy could be seen as a long-term challenge. This is the point at which the aftermath of 476 becomes directly connected to the next major transformation in Italy. Theoderic did not arrive as a simple invader in the way later national narratives sometimes suggest. He was, in Roman terms, a leader whose relationship to the empire included negotiated titles and obligations. The Eastern court could frame his movement into Italy as an imperial policy, sending a powerful federate leader to remove a rebellious ruler and govern Italy in a manner acceptable to Constantinople. Whether this policy was consistently planned from the start or evolved through shifting circumstances is difficult to pin down in all its details, but the resulting mechanism is visible. The East used one armed coalition to manage another, attempting to reassert influence over Italy without committing the full resources of a direct imperial reconquest. The conflict between Odoacer and Theoderic began in 489, when Theoderic entered Italy. The war that followed was not a quick coup like 476, but a prolonged struggle, fought across northern Italy and culminating in key battles and sieges. Odoacer was not simply swept away. He retained substantial support and military capacity and could hold fortified positions. The fighting itself is important for understanding what the post-imperial West looked like in practice. It was a landscape of fortified cities, contested supply lines, and armies that still fought in late Roman styles of organization. even when led by kings rather than emperors. Ravenna again became central because of its defensive qualities and because it was an administrative hub. Its marshy surroundings and access to the sea made it difficult to take quickly. When Theoderic finally took Ravenna in 493, it was through negotiation and a settlement that was supposed to end the conflict. The subsequent killing of Odoacer by Theoderic is reported in our sources and became a defining episode of Theoderic's seizure of power. The exact wording of agreements and the full context of the killing are subject to the limits of the surviving narratives, but the consequence is clear. Odoacer's regime ended, and Italy entered a new phase under Ostrogothic rule. This sequence matters because it shows that 476 did not end Roman government in Italy. It changed the identity of the apex ruler, and that apex could be replaced again through military and diplomatic maneuvering. Under Theoderic, many Roman administrative forms continued. Roman aristocrats continued to hold significant positions. Roman law continued to function for Roman subjects, and the ideal of imperial legitimacy remained present, now expressed through Theoderic's relationship with Constantinople. Theoderic ruled as king, not as Western emperor, but he maintained a court and an administrative apparatus that in many ways resembled late Roman governance, precisely because those mechanisms were still effective for ruling Italy's population and extracting resources. This continuity is not a denial of transformation. The composition of the ruling military elite changed. The legal status distinctions between Goths and Romans in some contexts mattered. Patronage networks shifted. The balance between civilian and military authority was different when the top ruler was a king, whose legitimacy depended on armed followers and diplomatic recognition, rather than on being an Augustus. But the continued use of Roman administrative techniques is part of the factual explanation for why Italy remained governable, and why the end of the Western imperial office did not immediately erase Roman ways of life. If the question is how the Western Empire fell first, and what then replaced it, the years after 476 provide a concrete answer. The imperial office in the West ceased to be the organizing center. In its place emerged a pattern of successor regimes that governed through Roman institutions while resting on armed groups led by kings. These kings, in turn, sought legitimacy by associating themselves with Roman authority, sometimes with explicit deference to Constantinople. The Eastern Empire remained a critical reference point. Even when it could not dictate outcomes in Italy, its recognition, titles, and diplomacy shaped what rulers could credibly claim. The longer arc that follows points toward the 6th century, when the Eastern Empire under Justinian attempted direct reconquest of Italy. That later war, fought decades after 476, is one of the clearest demonstrations that Rome did not simply vanish in the West at the moment Romulus was deposed. The Eastern government still claimed Italy as part of the empire and still believed it could be governed as such. The very possibility of that claim rested on the fact that Roman law, Roman administrative memory, and Roman elite cooperation had persisted under Odoacer and Theoderic. The empire that fell in the West did not collapse into an administrative blank. It fractured at the top and then continued in altered forms beneath new rulers, until later wars and economic disruptions reshaped the landscape again. What remains most important, if the focus is on catalysts and mechanisms, is that the deposition of Romulus Augustulus set a precedent that proved durable. Italy could be ruled without a Western emperor. The old constitutional structure had depended on a Western Augustus, who could claim to command armies and appoint officials across Western provinces. By 476, those provinces were already largely beyond such command, and the army in Italy could determine the ruler directly. Once a king could govern Italy with Roman administrative cooperation, and with at least toleration from Constantinople, the Western imperial throne became not a necessity but a liability, an extra layer that could invite rival claimants and impose costs. That is why it was not revived in Italy after 476. Even though Roman political language and Roman governmental practice continued to be used. After Odoacer's death in 493, the structure that replaced the Western imperial court in Italy did not revert to a Western Augustus. It hardened into a different kind of regime, a king ruling from Italy with an armed following, while preserving Roman administrative routines and legal forms, because those were still the most practical tools for governing a densely populated, highly stratified society. Theodoric, the Ostrogothic leader who defeated Odoacer, became the central figure in this new arrangement, and the details of his rule show exactly how Roman government could persist without a Western emperor, and also where the limits of that persistence lay. Theodoric's position was built on two foundations that could coexist but never perfectly fused. One foundation was military. He led a people and an army whose cohesion depended on land, reward, and leadership. The other was administrative. Italy still functioned through Roman law, taxation practices, urban elites, and senatorial networks that expected governance to be expressed in Roman terms. Theodoric needed both. Without the military base, he could not hold Italy. Without Roman administration, he could not reliably feed and finance the military base or keep elite cooperation. This dual structure shaped the way authority was communicated. Theodoric did not present himself as Emperor of the West. The imperial office in the West remained unfilled, yet his regime repeatedly signaled continuity with Roman order. Roman offices continued to exist and be staffed by Roman elites. The Senate at Rome continued as a prestigious institution. Roman legal culture remained central in disputes among Roman subjects. Theodoric's government issued orders and decisions in a manner that fit within late Roman administrative habits, even when the ultimate authority behind them was a king rather than an Augustus. At the same time, there was a real and practical distinction in how the kingdom's two main populations were organized for certain purposes. Roman subjects largely remained under Roman civil administration and law. Goths were organized under their own military leadership structures, and their cohesion was maintained through their own internal hierarchy and identity. The regime could function as long as these spheres did not collide too directly. When they did collide, especially over land, taxation burdens, or religious and political loyalty, the system could generate crises. Land settlement remained a central technical problem. In many post-imperial Western regimes, the settlement of armed followers was managed through some combination of land grants, assignment of revenues, or allocation of shares in existing estates. The exact legal mechanisms in Italy are complex and not always fully visible in surviving texts, but the broad outcome is visible in the relative stability of Theodoric's reign. A workable arrangement was reached that kept Gothic forces supplied without provoking immediate collapse of the Roman landowning order. That was not a one-time act but an ongoing administrative practice, because land produces revenue only through stable cultivation, stable tenancies, and enforceable rights, things that require courts, records, and local cooperation. Taxation and state finance under Theodoric illustrates continuity and constraint. Italy still had a functioning fiscal apparatus compared with many other Western regions, but it did not have the old Western imperial fiscal reach. Africa remained outside Italian control. This meant that Italy's regime had to be careful about overburdening its own tax base. At the same time, it needed enough revenue to maintain courts, officials, infrastructure maintenance where possible, and above all, military readiness. Late Roman taxation had always been a balance between extraction and sustainability. In a kingdom whose legitimacy rested partly on appearing to preserve Roman order, that balance was politically sensitive. Theodoric also had to manage relations with the Eastern Empire in Constantinople. The Eastern Court remained the custodian of imperial legitimacy. Even if it could not station an emperor in Italy, it could confer titles, recognize rulers, and shape diplomatic expectations. Theodoric's relationship with the East was therefore a pillar of stability, but also a potential vulnerability. If relations with Constantinople deteriorated, the Eastern government could seek alternatives, supporting rivals, encouraging opposition, or eventually planning intervention. Theodoric's reign therefore depended partly on keeping that relationship functional enough that a costly Eastern campaign against Italy seemed unnecessary or impractical. This is where the larger Western landscape matters. Italy under Theodoric was not isolated. The Western Mediterranean and Western Europe were a patchwork of successor kingdoms. Visigoths in parts of Gaul and Spain, Burgundians in southeastern Gaul, Franks expanding in northern Gaul, Vandals in North Africa, and others. Italy's rulers had to treat these as both threats and diplomatic partners. Theodoric's government built alliances through diplomacy and dynastic connections, aiming to stabilize Italy's borders and reduce the risk that a neighboring kingdom would support internal opponents. The practical mechanics of this diplomacy included marriages, hostage arrangements, embassies, treaties, and the ever-present possibility of military intervention. The one realm that most directly constrained Italy's security and economy remained North Africa. The Vandals' control of Africa had strategic consequences for sea routes, for Sicily and other islands, and for the flow of goods in the central Mediterranean. Any Italian ruler who could not recover Africa had to manage the Vandal relationship, either through war when possible or through negotiation when necessary. The mere existence of a strong naval power in Africa meant that Italy's coastal security and maritime commerce were always exposed to disruption. This mattered for the economy, for provisioning, and for the sense of stability that kept elites cooperative. Theodoric's Italy, however, did experience a degree of stability compared with the decades before 476. That stability rested on his ability to keep the army cohesive, to keep Roman elites invested in continuity, and to avoid provoking the Eastern Empire into intervention. But the system contained failure modes that became more visible near the end of his reign. One failure mode was succession. Roman imperial succession had its own chronic problems, but it was supported by long-standing ideological and administrative forms. Adoption, dynastic claims, recognition by armies, and a court apparatus that could elevate a successor. In a kingdom where authority rested on the personal leadership of a king and the cohesion of his military following, succession could be more fragile. If the next ruler could not command the same loyalty, the whole balance could tilt. Another failure mode was the interaction of religion and politics. In the late 5th and early 6th centuries, the Eastern Empire and the Roman Church were deeply involved in theological and ecclesiastical disputes, and religious identity was intertwined with political loyalty. In Italy, religious divisions could be interpreted through the lens of allegiance, whether to the king's regime, to the Senate's traditional networks, or to the Eastern Emperor and imperial church policies. When political trust weakened, religious differences could become more combustible. A third failure mode was the senatorial aristocracy's position. Roman senators and great landowners could cooperate with a king as long as their status and property were protected, and as long as the king's regime plausibly preserved Roman legal order. But senatorial networks also had connections beyond Italy, including ties to Constantinople and to church leadership. If the king's regime began to suspect those elites of disloyalty, or if elites began to see the Eastern Emperor as a viable alternative, cooperation could break down. By the time of Theoderic's later years, the sources describe episodes that reflect these stresses. Accusations of treason or conspiracy, political trials, and a more brittle relationship between the king and parts of the Roman elite. The specifics of particular cases must be treated cautiously because our narratives are shaped by later perspectives. But the pattern is consistent with the structural tension. A regime built on balancing distinct constituencies becomes more coercive when it feels threatened, and coercion then erodes trust further. Theoderic died in 526. His death is a hard chronological marker, because it begins the phase in which the Ostrogothic kingdom's stability was tested without the personal authority that had held it together. The regime that followed faced immediate difficulties of succession and regency. Internal factions could form around different candidates, different military leaders, and different approaches to relations with Constantinople. Each faction's choices were not merely political preferences. They were decisions about how to allocate land, offices, and military commands, exactly the points at which a post-imperial kingdom could fracture. This internal fragility intersected with a major change in the Eastern Empire's capacity and strategy under Justinian, who became emperor in 527. Justinian's government pursued a policy of reconquest in parts of the former Western Empire, aiming to restore imperial authority over territories now ruled by successor kingdoms. This was not an abstract ideological project. It was a strategic and fiscal program that depended on the Eastern Empire's ability to mobilize armies, fleets, and money, and on its ability to exploit opportunities created by instability in the West. North Africa became the first major target. In 533-534, Eastern forces under the general Belisarius defeated the Vandal kingdom and restored imperial control over the African provinces. This event is essential for understanding what came next in Italy, because it changed the strategic balance in the central Mediterranean. With Africa back under Eastern control, Constantinople regained a key revenue base and a naval platform close to Italy. It could now support sustained operations in the Western Mediterranean more feasibly than it could in the 5th century. Italy then became the next major target. The Gothic War began in 535, again with Belisarius playing a leading role. The mechanics of the war reveal the continuity of Roman infrastructure and the ways it could be used against Italy by an imperial power with maritime reach. Eastern forces could seize key coastal cities and ports, use fleets to supply armies, and exploit divisions among Italian elites and Gothic leadership. Cities, fortifications, and supply lines mattered intensely. The war was not a simple set-piece contest. It was a prolonged struggle of sieges, shifting alliances, and the control of strategic nodes like Naples, Rome, and Ravenna. Rome itself became a contested city multiple times. The fact that it could change hands, be besieged, and be reoccupied shows both the symbolic importance of the old capital and the practical reality that late antique warfare in Italy was often about strongpoints, provisioning, and endurance. Italian civilian populations suffered during these operations through requisitions, displacement, and disruption of agriculture. The war's duration amplified these effects. A region can survive a single campaign season. It struggles under decade-long instability that repeatedly interrupts planting, harvest, and trade. Belisarius captured Ravenna in 540, a significant milestone because Ravenna had long been a seat of Italian rule and an administrative hub. Yet the war did not end. Gothic resistance persisted and reorganized. Leadership changed, and new commanders emerged. The conflict entered phases of resurgence and counteroffensive, demonstrating that the Eastern Empire's ability to capture cities did not automatically translate into stable control over the countryside or permanent political settlement. Eventually, the Eastern Empire committed further resources and leadership, with the general Narses playing a decisive role in later phases. Major battles in the 550s broke Gothic military capacity, and by the mid-550s, the Ostrogothic kingdom as a ruling structure was effectively ended, though local resistance and the aftereffects persisted. The Eastern Empire re-established imperial administration in Italy in a formal sense, issuing laws and appointing officials in the imperial name. This, however, is also where the costs of restoration become part of the story of the West's long transformation. Even when imperial authority returned, the decades of war had damaged Italy's economic base, depopulated or impoverished some regions, and weakened the very administrative and fiscal structures that made Roman governance effective. The Eastern Empire could claim Italy, but governing it profitably and securely was harder after such a prolonged conflict. In other words, the Reconquest demonstrated that imperial institutions could be reintroduced, but it also revealed how much the material foundations of those institutions had been eroded. Not long after the Gothic War, new pressures emerged in Italy, including invasions by the Lombards beginning in 568. That movement further fragmented Italy's political map, limiting the Eastern Empire's control largely to certain regions and cities for long periods. This is beyond the immediate chain from 476, but it is part of the broader answer to whether 476 was the end. It was the end of the Western Emperor in Italy. It was not the end of Roman political claims or Roman administrative practice. The deeper ending, in terms of Italy ceasing to function as a stable, unified Roman imperial heartland, is more closely tied to the cumulative effects of 6th century warfare and subsequent fragmentation than to the single deposition of Romulus. So the continuation after 476 is not a different story. It is the unfolding of what 476 made possible. Once the Western imperial office was abandoned, Italy became a prize and a platform, first for Odoacer as a military king, then for Theoderic as a king who preserved much of Roman administration, then for Justinian as an emperor attempting to restore direct imperial rule. Each stage shows the same underlying mechanisms returning in different forms: control of armies, access to revenue, the cooperation of administrative elites, and the strategic importance of Africa and sea power in the central Mediterranean. What followed in Italy did not undo what 476 had done. It made the meaning of that year clearer by showing how much could continue without a Western Augustus, and by showing what could not be restored once the imperial office had become optional. The deposition of Romulus Augustulus was therefore not an ending in the sense of a sudden disappearance of Roman life, but an ending in the sense that a particular constitutional habit stopped being practiced. The habit of maintaining a resident Western emperor in Italy as the apex of a court that could plausibly command the Western provinces. To understand why that habit stopped, and why it did not resume, the surviving evidence has to be read in two layers at once. what the narrative sources claim happened, and what administrative continuity demonstrates about what the change actually was. The narrative sources do not present 476 as a single, universally agreed, fall, witnessed, and described with full detail at the time. They are uneven, brief, and written from different vantage points, often with later political concerns shaping what they highlight. What they do preserve in common is a sequence that is more like a military and administrative turnover than a civilizational catastrophe. Julius Nepos, installed as Western emperor with Eastern recognition, was driven out of Italy in 475 by Orestes. Orestes did not assume the title of Augustus. He placed his son Romulus on the throne and ruled through him. That choice itself is a sign of how Western politics in Italy had come to function. The throne had become a tool to clothe a commander's authority in imperial language, rather than the seat from which an emperor personally commanded the state. The trigger for what followed was not an external invasion that overwhelmed Italy in a single stroke. It was an internal rupture between the regime and the troops on whom it depended. The army in Italy included many men drawn from the late imperial military world in which service, identity, and reward were often mediated through commanders and through expectations of settlement or shares in land revenues. The sources speak of these troops under group labels such as Heruli, Scieri, and Tersalingi, not as an inventory of a modern army register, but as the shorthand of late antique observers describing the human material of the Italian field forces. Those troops demanded a settlement in Italy that would secure their position through land or its revenues. Orestes refused. The refusal mattered because it exposed a deeper reality. The Western court in Italy no longer had a robust and dependable fiscal engine with which to buy military loyalty by pay alone. Yet conceding land on a scale that satisfied the troops threatened the cooperation of the landowning and senatorial elites, whose estates and networks made administration and taxation feasible. Odoacer emerged as the leader around whom the discontented troops coalesced. He defeated Orestes, took Ravenna, and deposed Romulus in 476. The sparing of Romulus is not a sentimental detail, but an institutional one. It suggests that the person of the emperor was no longer the crucial node of power. If the boy could be removed and neutralized without the political necessity of execution, then the office had become detachable from the real machinery of command. The coup had succeeded because it captured the army and the administrative center, not because it performed a ritual destruction of Rome. This is where the famous constitutional gesture enters the tradition. The story that the imperial regalia were sent to the Eastern emperor, and that Italy indicated it no longer required a separate Western emperor. Some sources preserve this as a decisive symbolic act, and it has endured because it compresses a complicated constitutional shift into a single scene of closure. Yet even here, the best reading is not to treat the gesture as a magical switch that ended an empire, but as a practical move to stabilize power. Odoacer had no interest in provoking a costly Eastern intervention if it could be avoided. He had every interest in converting a coup into a government by presenting his rule as compatible with imperial unity under Constantinople. The sending of insignia, if understood in substance rather than in later rhetorical polish, fits this logic. It was a way to say that Italy could be governed without a Western Augustus, while still speaking in the language of Roman legitimacy that mattered to elites and officials. At the same time, the sources themselves prevent a perfectly clean ending in 476, because Julius Nepos did not cease to exist as a claimant that year. He remained alive and continued to hold the Western imperial title in exile, commonly associated with Dalmatia, until his death in 480. That fact changes the meaning of 476 if one is precise. It means 476 was not the instant extinction of the Western imperial idea. It was the end of the Western imperial court in Italy. The difference between a title and a functioning government is the difference between a name on paper and an apparatus that can collect revenue, supply soldiers, appoint officials, and enforce decisions. In 476, the apparatus in Italy passed to a king. The title, for a time, still existed elsewhere. This is where administrative and material continuity becomes the second necessary layer of evidence. What ended in Italy was not the use of Roman law, not the existence of Roman offices, not the Senate's prestige, and not the everyday habits of courts and property. A ruler who controlled Italy could govern it more effectively by preserving those instruments than by discarding them. Italy still depended on the cooperation of landowners, city elites, and trained officials. Records, legal procedure, fiscal routines, and the social authority of senatorial rank were not ornamental. They were how order was maintained without constant violence. If taxation in coin was limited and coercion was expensive, continuity was an economy. So the immediate post-Minus 476 reality in Italy was best described as a change at the apex, with much of the skeleton below retained. The Senate remained a corporate body of high-status men. Roman aristocrats continued to matter because their estates produced surplus, and because their networks mediated compliance. Roman legal culture continued because it made land tenure and obligations enforceable. Offices connected to finance and justice continued because no alternative system could manage the same complexity with the same legitimacy among the Roman population. Even the presentation of authority continued in Roman forms where it was useful, because Roman forms were the language through which governance was recognized. Continuity here does not mean stasis. It means that the regime in Italy had incentives to keep the administrative machine running, while redirecting its highest command away from an emperor and toward a king. The alteration lay most sharply in how military loyalty was secured and how sovereignty was conceptualized. Under the earlier imperial model, the ideal was a salaried army supported by a tax system that could be coordinated across provinces under imperial command. In 5th century Italy, that model had become increasingly difficult to sustain. The pressure for land or revenue assignment as a mode of military reward was not a peripheral feature. It was the mechanism that made 476 possible. Once a significant part of the Italian army believed its future depended on settlement, and once a commander could promise settlement, the balance of power shifted. The emperor as a constitutional figure could not compel troops without resources. The king, as a military leader, could hold troops with promises that reallocated resources. That is why the deposition of Romulus was possible, and it is why it was not reversed. The continuation of Roman administration under a king also clarifies why the year 476 became such a powerful marker later. It was not chosen because contemporaries thought Roman civilization ended that day. It became the marker because it is the moment the Western imperial office stopped being filled in Italy, and because that vacancy endured. When later writers looked for a date to represent the end of a familiar constitutional arrangement, 476 offered a clean story. A boy emperor deposed, insignia sent away, a king ruling. The story's neatness is part of its appeal, but its neatness can mislead if it is mistaken for a complete description of what happened to Roman power in the West. By 476, Much of the West beyond Italy had already moved into successor regimes that were not governed by the Western emperor in practice. Visigoths, Burgundians, Franks, and Vandals controlled substantial territories, and they did so through a mixture of their own armed leadership and the reuse of Roman administrative habits where those habits remained functional. In those regions, Roman law could persist in courts, Roman bishops could function as civic leaders, and Roman tax routines could survive in altered forms, even as the ultimate authority shifted to kings. This matters because it shows that the fall in 476 was not the cause of the West's fragmentation so much as its confirmation in Italy. The Western emperor had already been losing the ability to command the Western provinces. In 476, Italy itself ceased to pretend otherwise. From that point, the reasons the Western throne was not restored in Italy become visible in plain institutional arithmetic. A Western emperor required a court apparatus and a fiscal capacity to sustain an imperial style of rule. A king could govern with fewer costs and with clearer control over the military coalition that actually held power. A king could also seek legitimacy through negotiated recognition from Constantinople, keeping the ideological claim of Roman unity in play, while avoiding the practical burden of resurrecting a Western imperial administration that no longer had secure provinces to administer. Once that combination proved workable, the Western Augustus became redundant. Redundancy in political systems is often the true meaning of an ending, not destruction but replacement by a cheaper, more functional configuration. So the topic closes at the point where the evidence supports a firm conclusion and where it demands restraint. It supports firmly that 476 was the end of a resident Western emperor in Italy and the beginning of a regime in which a king ruled Italy while preserving Roman administrative practices because they remained useful and because elite cooperation still mattered. It supports firmly that the catalyst was the long weakening of Western fiscal and military capacity, the rise of military kingmaking, and the loss of key revenue provinces that made traditional payroll solutions less reliable. It supports firmly that the trigger was a land and reward crisis within the Italian army that Orestes could not resolve, and that Odoacer resolved by force and by promising settlement. And it demands, equally firmly, that the fall not be narrated as if Roman administration vanished overnight. The Senate endured as a social and political institution. Roman law and offices continued to structure property and disputes. Church and civic networks continued to mediate governance. The West did not become non-Roman in a single year. What ended in 476 was the Western imperial court's role in Italy as the apex of power. What began in its place was a post-imperial arrangement in which kings could rule using Roman tools, while the Eastern emperor remained the main reservoir of imperial legitimacy. That is the shape of the ending that 476 truly marks, not the disappearance of Rome, but the end of the Western emperor as a necessary instrument of rule in the West.